What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we are going to be taking a deep dive into each of the main card fights taking place at UFC 271. We're going to be breaking down each of these matchups from a betting perspective, and hopefully you'll be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions and maybe even earn some extra cash. And if you'd like to watch breakdown videos for all the other fights taking place at UFC 271 on the prelims, you can find those on my website mma-bettingtips.com. You'll find a link for that in the description below. On that website you'll also find a wide range of bets for UFC 271. Pretty much all of those types of bets are profitable long term, and you'll also find a VIP chat room where you can engage with myself and other members of the community. Check it out, I think you're going to like it a lot. But remember, this video, it's not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do. I strongly recommend that if you do want to bet this card, you do your own research, and please remember to gamble responsibly. I am just a guy that sits in my pants all day watching fights, but because I do put so much time into the fight research, a lot of the stuff that you're going to learn in this video is based on past performances from the fighters we're going to cover in today's video, and so they do give us a pretty good indicator of how this weekend's matchups are likely to go. And with that being said, gamble responsibly. This is not financial advice, but I do bet on MMA for a living, have done for a long time. I've made a lot of money betting on MMA, and so, you know, there is a little bit of weight to the things that we will be discussing in this video. And don't forget, as ever, please hit a like button. Please hit the like button if you do like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Why would you not subscribe? Why would you not want to hear me waffling on for hours about fights every week? And of course, leave a comment below. Let me know what your bets are. Let me know if you think I missed anything out in this video. Let me know what you think of some of the things that I talk about in this video. So let's kick things off. We are going to start off with the main event, the rematch between Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker, and what a great fight it is. Obviously these guys fought all the way back in 2019, but from a betting perspective and the perspective of where these guys are in their careers at the moment, this is a very different fight to what we had all the way back in 2019. If we look at the odds on this one, they're obviously very, very different from where they were back in 2019, because now Israel Adesanya is one of the biggest favourites on the card at average odds of about 1.36, which is minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. And if we take a look at the odds on Robert Whittaker, he is currently around an average of 3.30, which is plus 230 for an implied probability of 30%. So now we've got Israel Adesanya as a very big favourite and a million miles away from where he was in the very, very first fight. So if we go to my betting results and scroll all the way down to the database, and we type Adesanya in, we can see that a bet on 4 of Adesanya's fights. Have gone 3-1 when betting on Adesanya's fights. But in their very, very first fight, I did bet on Adesanya to win, which would make you think that, you know, I would feel pretty confident in him going into this rematch between Robert Whittaker. But things are very different now. I do feel that both guys have changed a lot since that first fight, and we're going to be talking a lot about what has changed since their first fight in this video. But obviously the odds are obviously very different as well, and I always say, if you've watched my content for a long time, you'll know that I kind of preach that you've got to let the odds do the work for you. And the risk to reward ratio you get on betting Adesanya as a 1.91, you know, minus 10, you know, fighter in that even money odds range is very different to the risk to reward ratio you're getting on him now at that 1.36, which was minus 278 odds range. Completely different risk to reward ratios. So, you know, if both these guys were fighting this weekend and they were both in the even money odds range, 1.91 minus 110, I'd absolutely bet Israel Adesanya for a second time against Robert Whittaker. But that's not the case. We've got different odds, different risk to reward ratio, and therefore we need to take a look at this fight from a very different perspective. Now, what's very interesting about this matchup is all the way back in 2019 when I made a breakdown video for this fight. You know, I'll actually leave a link to it in the description below, or maybe I'll put it up here. You could kind of watch my old breakdown video for the first fight. A lot of people in the comments and a lot of people came to me during fight week saying, They think Israel Adesanya is a bad bet, and they're going to bet on Robert Whittaker because Whittaker can use his wrestling to beat Izzy. And back then, my perspective on that was, maybe that can happen, but we've never seen Robert Whittaker use a grappling heavy game plan before. So in the even money odds range, I think it's a little bit irrational not to bet Izzy based on Whittaker turning up and using a game plan and a strategy that we never really see him use. So in that even money odds range, because we're getting roughly a 1-to-1, payout for betting Izzy, if you were to bet $100, you get close to $100 back. I didn't feel it made sense to put a lot of weight on Whittaker coming into that matchup with a grappling heavy game plan, because he'd never used that type of strategy before. It's different now though, because when you have roughly a 1-to-1 payout on a bet, right? You bet $100, you get roughly $100 back. You can afford to take on a lot more risk and still be profitable long term. You don't need to maintain as high of a win rate on bets in that odds range to grind out a long term profit. But when you're betting fighters in this odds range, your margin for error is, very, very low. You've pretty much got to be hitting a win rate of like 80% to make any kind of decent return betting fighters in this odds range, which is an extremely difficult thing to do in a sport as chaotic and unpredictable as MMA. So whenever I see fighters in this odds range, I need them to have virtually no way for them to lose in order to consider betting them. And I will only bet them in this odds range if I think, they basically have no way to lose unless something crazy happens. So the first time they fought, I wasn't really... it wasn't a deal breaker for me that Whittaker could come in with a grappling heavy game plan, because the odds on Izzy, meant I was still getting a good risk to reward ratio. But that's different now. That is very different now. And it's different because both these guys have shown us a lot more elements, a lot more layers to them since they first fought. If we take a look at their performances since they fought back in 2019, we've seen different sides to them that they didn't really show us before they fought back in 2019. And so for that reason, we've got new information to work with when we're breaking down their rematch, which does change my perspective a little bit on how this one could play out. In terms of the tail of the tape though, we can see that Izzy is 32 years old, 6'4" with an 80-inch reach. And Robert Whittaker's 31 years old, 6 foot tall with a 73.5-inch reach. So that's almost a 7-inch reach advantage to Izzy. Robert Whittaker's quite small for a middleweight. We've seen the size difference before. We know Izzy's going to be quite a bit bigger than Whittaker in the octagon on Saturday night. And Izzy probably does a better job than anyone else in the UFC of fighting long, using that reach and using his length. So that's going to be something that we'll refer to quite a bit in this video when we discuss how these two guys match up from a striking point of view. But I'm jumping about a little bit, and it's time we get back on track, add a little bit more structure to this breakdown, and stop beating around the bush and talk about how both these guys have changed since they first fought back in 2019. So I think the easiest one to talk about is Robert Whittaker, because in the Israel Adesanya fight and in Robert Whittaker's performances leading up to the Israel Adesanya fight, Robert Whittaker was one of these, aggressive, powerful, marauding, warrior, type fighters that would just come forward, bet on his chin against yours, his toughness against yours, his gas tank against yours, and he would look to come forward, force you to engage, and he would rely on his ability to take whatever you can throw at him and fire back with his own big right hand to get you out of there. And a lot of Robert Whittaker's fights were very exciting, but they were often wars as well. And, Whittaker took a lot of damage in his fights, but ultimately he had the gas tank, the toughness, the chin to see him through. And he was a great champion. He still is a great fighter. And that was the style that we kind of saw from Whittaker leading into that Izzy fight. And we even saw that in the Izzy fight, right? If you go back and watch it, both guys stood in the middle of the octagon and went toe-to-toe. Neither of them took a backward step, and they both just tried to take each other out. And ultimately, it was Izzy that got the job done. But since losing to Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker has shown us a very different style. He's now a lot more strategic, a lot more tactical, a lot more calculated in his approach to his fights. And you now see him use a lot of counter-striking in his fights, whereas before he would always lead and be very aggressive. What we also see from Robert Whittaker these days is a lot more grappling built into his overall style, where he won't use a lot of grappling in his fights, but if you go back and watch his fights against, Gastelum and Cannonier in particular, he mixes things up now, whereas before you'd never really see him shoot a takedown. If he did, he wouldn't fully commit to it. Now he does shoot a decent amount of takedowns, and he's quite successful with them as well, because he's got the element of surprise on his side. His footwork's very good, his movement's very good, his striking is very dangerous. And so it's difficult to read the takedown entries, because when he comes forward, you don't know if a takedown's coming or a head kick or a big right hand. So Whittaker is mixing things up a lot more, being a lot more strategic, being a lot more unpredictable, and he's also fighting a lot safer. You don't see him get into crazy exchanges anymore. He's not as reckless or as chaotic as he used to be. He's much smarter about the damage that he's taking. He fights a lot safer, and he's a completely different problem for Izzy to solve coming into this matchup. But in terms of Izzy, we've also seen an evolution in his style, where on his run to the title, on his run into that Whittaker fight, and even again in that Whittaker fight, Izzy was a guy that almost had like a chip on his shoulder, a bit of an attitude and something to prove. And while he still has that kind of swag and that aura and that personality, that swag and that aura and that personality is present in everything that he does outside the octagon, but it is not true. It's not true of the version of Izzy we see in the octagon anymore. On his title run just before, the Whittaker fight and leading into the Whittaker fight, Izzy was an aggressive dude. He would look to stand his ground and counter you as you came forward. If he sensed you were hurt or getting tired, he would have that killer instinct in him where he would look to take you out. And if you went 25 minutes with Izzy, you could be sure that you would have taken a lot of damage. He would have destroyed your body, destroyed your legs, and you would have been busted up pretty badly and no doubt dropped a couple times as well. Since the Whittaker fight, though, we've seen Izzy, again, like Whittaker, become a lot more strategic and tactical. Whereas before he would still counter-strike a lot, he would have more intent with his attacks, and lead the dance and be the aggressor at times, particularly when momentum was swinging in his favour. Now what we see Izzy do is, stand back, play the role of matador, and look to counter-strike a lot more. He doesn't really get sucked into any crazy exchanges, and he doesn't look to take the fights to his opponent and inflict big damage and knock him out. He's quite happy, like I say, just to play the role of matador, let his opponents come to him, and he uses his length and his superior technique to pick them apart and pick them off. And like we said earlier in the breakdown video, no one does a better job of using their reach and their length than Izzy, so this is a strategy that works very well for him. But I do worry that with Israel Adesanya, we are seeing a phenomenon that we see with pretty much every dominant champion, and have seen with pretty much every dominant champion in the history of MMA, and that is when fighters win the title and they get the big paydays, the big sponsorships, the attention, the spotlight, the pay-per-view revenue, everything that comes with it, their style starts to change, where they move away from the style of fighting that got them to the dance in the first place, and then they start to become overly tactical, overly strategic, and fight in a way that is maybe to not lose as opposed to go out there and win. And this is a cycle that we see play out over and over and over again with dominant champions, and I'm starting to see it with Izzy. If we think about it, it happened to Jose Aldo. You think about Jose Aldo earlier in his career, in his title run, he would just smoke guys and KO them dead in a minute flat. GSP was a lot more aggressive in the early days of his title run. We saw the same thing happen to Matt Hughes, Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva went from crane kicking dudes in the face to getting involved in a lot of close, cagey decisions where he was passive and tentative. We saw Holloway go through this, towards the end of his title run. We saw John Jones definitely go through this towards the end of his title run. Think about how close the fights were against OSP, Dominic Reyes, and Thiago Santos in particular. And this is just a phenomenon, a cycle that we see repeat over and over and over and over and over again. And, you know, there are plenty of examples of this cycle playing out. Even Demetrius Johnson fell victim to this in the end. Who could forget how close the Tim Elliott fight was? And a lot of people will say that the reason why this happens is because, you know, when you're the champion, you're consistently competing against the best fighters in the world and in the division. And so you're always fighting the next toughest guy. And that's why, you know, champions get involved in a lot of close fights. And then there will be other people that say it happens because the more time champions spend on the big stage defending their title and, you know, performing in the cage, the more information challengers and contenders get on how to beat them, right? Because, you know, you watch footage on Max Holloway in 3 title fights that each last 25 minutes, you've now got over an hour's worth of footage on his strengths and weaknesses, and that gives you a good amount of information to develop a game plan and strategy tailored specifically towards beating him. And that's possibly what Israel Adesanya's teammate Alexander Volkanovski did with great success 2 times. So there's that. But personally, what I think happens is fighters spend their whole lives working their way towards becoming a UFC champion, and it's a dream for them, it's a big goal for them, and when they finally get there, they don't want to lose it. We see fighters often talk about the pressure of being a champion. Even Robert Whittaker's spoken about it, Cyborg has spoken about it, Jessica Andrade has spoken about it, Rose Namajunas has spoken about the burden of being the champion. And some fighters don't want to lose that belt, that title. Because when you lose the belt, the title, you go back to just being another fighter, right? And so I think they start to fight safer and more strategically and more tactically. And the end result of that is a lot of their fights turn out to be pretty close. And we've seen that with, you know, the Izzy fight against Jan Blachowicz fight. Jan won, but it was pretty close. The Yoel Romero fight, very, 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 very close. And if you go back and watch the Marvin Vettori fight in a cold light of day, that was pretty close as well. Had Vettori done things slightly differently here and there, that could have been a really, really, you know, that could have been a fight that could have gone either way if Vettori would have just made some slight adjustments, which I won't go into a lot of detail now, but there's a lengthy research video, 2-hour-long research video on this fight on my website. If you're really interested in that, you go check it out there. But the point I'm trying to make is we've got 2 very different versions of these fighters coming into the matchup this weekend, and so this is a different fight. So if we talk about how these guys do in each range now, that'll help us piece together how this fight is likely to go. And what I will say is, if this fight stays standing, you probably already guess what I'm going to say. I think it goes very badly for Robert Whittaker. I think if this fight stays standing, Izzy wins really comfortably. Now, I absolutely love Robert Whittaker. He's a great fighter. He's such a great character, right? He's got so much integrity. He's so stoic. He's a great role model. So I want to choose my words very carefully when I talk about Robert Whittaker's striking, because he's built a career from his striking. But I just feel that Izzy is levels and levels and levels and levels above Whittaker. Whittaker has this problem where he only really throws a very limited range of strikes. He has like certain pre-programmed combinations that he throws, and he doesn't really deviate from that very much. He'll either throw a jab, jab, right hook, a jab, right hook. He'll just come forward straight up with a right hook, or he'll substitute the right hook for a head kick. So he'll throw a jab, head kick, jab, jab, head kick. Or occasionally, he'll throw a jab, right hook, and then follow it up with a head kick after that. But everything that Robert Whittaker does stems from the jab. If you go back and watch his fights, you'll see every single power strike that he throws is set up by the jab. And I think he does this to measure distance, right? He doesn't care about landing the jab. He's not throwing the jab to land it on his opponent. He's throwing the jab out there to measure distance. Then he comes through and follows through with the right hand or the head kick. The problem with this style is because he kind of only throws pre-programmed combinations at his opponents, he does become quite easy to read. And we know Israel Adesanya is a master of reading his opponents. And so he knows as soon as the jab comes, something bigger, either the right hand or the head kick, or the right hand and then the head kick, is coming behind it. And so Izzy knows as soon as Rob comes forward with a jab, he just needs to back up, circle away, and he's going to be absolutely fine. And what was interesting is in the first fight, we pointed this out. I'll leave a link to the first breakdown in the description below. And if you go back and watch the first fight, you can actually see Whittaker leading with the jab, and then you could see Izzy slipping the jab and then coming back with big counter shots. And that's ultimately how he knocked down Whittaker and then eventually knocked him out. So in terms of striking, I don't want to say any derogatory words or anything like that, but I just don't think Whittaker's on Izzy's level. And I think the strategy that Izzy has used in his recent fights in terms of staying on the outside, being very patient, playing the role of Matador, and just using his length and his size and his technique and his speed and his accuracy to just pick Whittaker off as he comes forward, I think that's going to be a pretty effective style. I guess it's also worth mentioning that we have seen Robert Whittaker injure his legs in fights. He's blown his knee out in a few of his past fights. And we do know that Izzy likes to attack the legs. Does big damage with his leg kicks. He obviously damn near stopped Paulo Costa with leg kicks. And he also buckled the leg and swept the leg of Vettori a few times late in the fight because of cumulative damage that he did to the lead leg of Vettori. So that's another factor for us to take into consideration. But something that's very, very different about this matchup this time around is the threat of Robert Whittaker's grappling. Because remember, earlier on in this breakdown video, we did talk a lot about how Whittaker had started to use a lot more grappling in his recent fights. And so what I now want to do is play some clips for you from an interview that Robert Whittaker did with Ariel Helwani last month, which do give us some clues as to what Whittaker's approach to this fight might be. And then once you listen to these clips, we can discuss what he said and try to quantify what it means in the context of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view. So, first thing that I want to show you is this new gym that Whittaker has opened up.
I saw some of the footage, and we're going to show some of it right here. You won't be able to see it, but the audience will. This gym is incredible, Robert. Can you tell us about it? Where is it?
Yeah.
Well, and tell us the whole detail. How big is it?
Like given the exact spec.
So as you can see up here, this is Robert Whittaker's new gym that he's opened, which absolutely phenomenal. I'm so happy for him. Look at the size of this thing. Looks like a brilliant facility. So looks like Whittaker's doing great, which I'm so happy about because he's such a good dude. But you can see up the top here, this branding. It says Camden Valley Wrestling. So I know that this is a mixed martial arts gym, but for Robert Whittaker to make wrestling such a prominent part of this gym says to me that he's very passionate about wrestling and he takes wrestling very, very seriously. And it's a big part of his life and potentially a big part of his strategy coming into this fight against Izzy. And if we carry on playing the video,
Specs of it is too hard for me, but you can see from the picture it is absolutely massive. It's around the corner from our last gym.
Okay.
Meeting Grange, Dunn Road. So it is unbelievable to have that amount of space to be able to camp in there and do our things and have heaps of mats.
And there you can even see Robert Whittaker's got the Camden Valley Wrestling t-shirt on. So it's not just the logo on the building, he's actually rocking a wrestling t-shirt. So we know that Whittaker is a guy that's built his career, basically with his striking, but this guy seems to be evolving now, and not only has he started to use more wrestling in his fights, but he has also opened his own wrestling gym pretty much. So this is something else that is very interesting that Whittaker said in this interview, where he is talking about how he feels coming into this matchup against Izzy. So listen to this.
There were some fights he's had where he just looked untouchable, like that Costa fight. He looked unbelievable there. But then he fought Marvin, and I just thought he can be beaten. It's not to say it's going to be easy or that I will beat him. It's just that it's a good fight, but I think he's beatable. Jan is direct evidence towards that.
Mm-hmm. Has it been frustrating?
So there you can kind of hear Whittaker talk about things that he's seen in the Jan Blachowicz and Marvin Vettori fights that show him that Izzy is beatable. Now remember earlier on in the breakdown, I was saying that the Vettori and Izzy fight was actually a lot closer than people realise, and if Vettori would have done things slightly differently, he stood a great chance of winning that. I say I don't want this video to be super long. That would be another 20-30 minutes in itself. But if you do want to understand more about what I mean, there is a long fight research video on my website detailing that. But what's very interesting about this interview, and again, I don't want this video to be super long, so I'm not going to play this whole interview for you, but the running theme throughout this interview with Ariel Helwani is that Robert Whittaker keeps saying that leading into the first fight against Izzy, he had this aura about him where he was untouchable and he looked incredible, and you kind of get the impression that Whittaker maybe wasn't the most confident going into that fight, or if he was confident, he knew he had a big challenge in front of him. Whereas it appears to me like Whittaker has watched the Marvin Vettori fight, watched the Jan Blachowicz fight, seen both those guys have a lot of success against Izzy, and he's taken a lot of confidence from that. So not only has he learned things that he can do from those fights to cause Izzy a problem now in this rematch, but it's also, I guess, made Izzy a little bit more human, whereas before, he was this, young, exciting, dangerous guy, and I'm imagining Whittaker really didn't want to end up on his highlight reel, whereas now he's like, okay, maybe this guy's not as scary as I thought he was. So this is a sequence later on in this interview where Whittaker kind of elaborates a little bit more on what he just said. He goes into a bit more detail, and this is very, very interesting. Listen to this.
Patience, striking, and takedown. Yeah, okay, there it is. What position and starts playing through the fight step by step. You know what I mean? But
what is the plan that you see in your head? Can you share that?
Yeah, okay, there it is.
Yeah,
I think Jan set the blueprint up to beat Izzy quite thoroughly. I think if we're looking at it, patience, striking, and takedowns were an opportunity. Okay, I think those three things are what leads you to beat someone like Israel.
Mm-hmm.
You got to avoid getting hit by his big counter striking punches and his big levers. You take him down when you can to make him uncomfortable, to slow his arms and legs down. And you got to be patient, because if you rush in, you get hit right in the face. Okay, but in saying that, you have to change the game plan Jan went in to account for Jan's pros and special traits that are unique to him, such as his Polish power and Polish head.
Yes, that is true. His size as well. He was bigger, right? Easier to keep him on the ground. Yeah, right.
And the fact that it was at 190. What is it? 194.
It was 205, but he came in a little light. Yeah.
The fact that it was at that, he's not as fast as he is when he's at middleweight. He's not as fast. His gas tank isn't as big, and the dynamic changes the fight. So, what you do is you take away what you can from that fight, and you try to. And I've tried to incorporate it into my own plan, utilizing my own traits, adding some different things, like adding the way I strike in. As you've seen in my last fights, I've been trying to mix in the takedowns and as much as I can when I see them, opportunity sort of thing. And that's the plan. I want to utilize my full skill set in this next fight and make him uncomfortable. I don't think it was a secret. There was no secret, and that's it. I just want to get in there and just make him uncomfortable, utilizing my full skill set.
You say you don't.
So I actually can't believe that Robert Whittaker was that open and honest about his game plan and strategy for this fight, because he basically told Izzy exactly what he plans to do. He was very upfront, very honest about it, and I guess that's why we love Robert Whittaker, right? He's such a great guy. But I was very, very honest, very, very surprised that he gave away that much information, and straight from the horse's mouth, what he's basically said is, in the first fight, I tried to beat a kickboxer, right? I tried to outstrike Izzy. I just stood in front of him, stood and banged. But now in this next fight, the rematch, I want to use my full skill set, my whole range of skills, grappling and striking. And that is so interesting to me, because if you go back and you watch Izzy's last two fights against Jan Blachowicz and Marvin Vettori, his takedown defense has looked really bad. anytime Marvin Vettori shot in deep on the hips and legs of Izzy, he either took Izzy down or came extremely close to taking him down. And the only times he shot in deep on the legs of Izzy and didn't take Izzy down was when Vettori didn't have the energy to fully commit to the takedown once he got there. And in the Jan Blachowicz fight, again, Izzy just gave up takedowns so easily. And what you also notice about Izzy is when Vettori and Blachowicz did put this guy on his back, he was very, very weak off his back. They found it very easy to just flatten him out and hold him down. Now, when you look at Robert Whittaker's style of offensive wrestling, it's very, very good. Partly because, you know, he sets his takedowns up very well because he mixes up his striking and takedowns very well. But partly because his timing's very good and he generates a lot of drive on his takedown entries. And he also throws, you know, quite a diverse range of takedown entries at his opponents. He's not just a one-trick pony. He'll go to body locks, single legs, double legs. You know, he'll go for a wide range of takedowns, which also makes him, you know, difficult to deal with. The problem with Whittaker is that he's not that big of a guy. He is quite a small middleweight, which is probably why, you know, one of the reasons why his gas tank is quite good. And Izzy, on the other hand, is a very, very big middleweight. So while Izzy is quite weak off his back, he kind of plays possum with his opponents when he's on the ground, where he will appear to be very weak on his back. He'll just lie there. He won't really make any effort to work his way back up to his feet. And then he pulls a trick that we see Derek Lewis pull a lot when Derek Lewis is on his back, in that all of a sudden Izzy will explode to life and suddenly show a lot of urgency to pop back up. And it catches his opponents out because of how easy they were finding it to hold him down. And then because he's so big and athletic, he's often able to get back up to his feet. Whittaker needs to be aware of that, because if he's not, with the size difference, I really think Whittaker's going to struggle to hold Izzy down. Now, what I also worry about with Whittaker in this is it's an oversimplification of MMA grappling to look at this and go, okay, Izzy's got bad takedown offense and he's quite weak off his back. Whittaker's a good offensive wrestler, therefore Whittaker's going to be able to use his wrestling to win this fight, right? That's a very overly simplified statement because we know MMA is very nuanced and very complex. Whittaker can absolutely use wrestling to beat Israel Adesanya, but he's got to use it in the right way. And from what he said to Ariel, I'm not sure if he understands the correct way to use MMA grappling to beat Izzy. And now you might watch this and you might think, you know, who's this guy from the UK, you know, questioning Whittaker's judgment and his fight IQ. This is a world champion. He knows 10 times more about MMA than this idiot talking about fights on the internet will ever know. You know, this guy's never fought a day in his life. Of course Whittaker knows what type of MMA grappling he needs to use in order to beat Izzy. But you'd be surprised. You'd really, really be surprised. I put a lot of work into research every week. I make a lot of money betting on MMA. And every single week when I sit down to watch UFC fights, I know the easiest path to victory for every single fighter that I watch on a Saturday night. And it would blow you away how often fighters don't understand what their easiest path to victory on fight night is. It's absolutely mind-boggling. It's very difficult for me to put into words how often it happens. And the problem with what Whittaker said against Ariel Helwani was that he said two different things. He said that he needed to use his grappling to put Izzy in uncomfortable positions and wear him down. And he's absolutely correct, he does. But he also said that he needs to mix things up more and be unpredictable and use a combination of his striking and grappling. And that I don't like so much, because we saw Marvin Vettori mix things up a fair bit and it didn't really work out for him because he wasn't able to keep Izzy down for long enough in that fight to win a decision. And the problem I've got with Whittaker is that in his last two fights against Gastelum and Cannonier, the type of grappling that he uses mixed in with his striking very much resembles what we saw from Vettori, where Whittaker would shoot maybe 1 takedown per round, or 1.5 takedowns every 2 rounds. But then if his opponent quickly popped back up to his feet, he wouldn't try to then take them back down in that round, and the rest of the round would take place standing. Another mistake that I would see Whittaker make is that he would take fighters down at the wrong time. So he would take them down, midway through a round or in the first half of a round, which would then give them a lot of time to scramble back up to their feet before the round ended and finish the round strong, which again is a tactical error, because we know judges tend to score rounds in favour of the fighter that finished the round stronger. You want to be taking guys down towards the end of a round and ending a round in a dominant position, and Whittaker didn't do that. The strategy that Whittaker needs to use in order to win this fight is to be relentless. To do exactly what Nick Maximov did to Punahele Soriano last week, and come forward, spam takedowns, stick to Izzy like glue, smother him in pressure, and keep trying to take him down. And it doesn't matter if Izzy quickly scrambles back up to his feet when he gets taken down, and it doesn't matter if you're struggling to take Izzy down. You just need to persist, because if you persist, as the fight wears on, Izzy will lack the energy to defend the takedowns, and then when you do get him down, he'll lack the energy to work his way back up to his feet. Exactly like what we saw with Punahele Soriano last week, when, early on in the fight, Nick Maximov would take Punahele Soriano down, and Soriano would immediately pop back up to his feet. But then deep into that second and third round, that's when you saw Nick have a lot more success holding Soriano down. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy to hold Izzy down, into the second and third round like with Soriano, but this is a 5-round fight. If you go back and watch the 4th and 5th rounds of the Jan Blachowicz fight, Jan was able to hold Izzy down very easily. And now I know Jan is a lot bigger than Izzy, but Izzy didn't make any effort to get back up to his feet. If he was trying to get back up to his feet and he couldn't because Jan was just too big and strong, fair enough, but he didn't try. And what's super interesting about that matchup is the first 3 rounds were contested at quite a slow pace. So you would have expected Izzy to have a decent amount of gas left in the tank in rounds 4 and 5. Imagine how weak Izzy may look off his back in rounds 4 and 5 at this one if Whittaker spams takedowns and forces him to exert a lot of energy to defend the takedowns in rounds 1 and 2. He can put major money in the bank, and that's how Whittaker wins this fight. The problem we've got from a betting point of view is we don't know if Whittaker's going to utilize that game plan and strategy, because he's never used it before. So we're right back where we were the first time these guys fought, where Whittaker absolutely has the skills, the technical ability to win this fight. He absolutely can, but we've never seen him use that strategy and game plan before. And what concerns me is the style of wrestling that he used against Gastelum and against Cannonier. I am not convinced will work that effectively against Izzy, because there wasn't enough of it. He didn't persist with the takedown. It was only 1 takedown per round here and there. That's not enough. You've got to persist. You've got to chain wrestle. Think about someone like a Khabib or a Gregor Gillespie or an Islam Makhachev. They stick to you like glue. They're relentless. They don't give you space to breathe. And Whittaker has the gas tank to do that. He has the skills to do that. But will he do that? We don't know. So from a betting point of view, for me, this is absolutely a dog or pass fight. There is no way I would touch Izzy at these odds for all the reasons I've discussed in this breakdown so far. This is Whittaker or pass in my opinion, and this is coming from someone that bet a lot of money on Israel Adesanya in their first fight. But there's no way you can bet Izzy as a heavy favourite here, because if Whittaker comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, we know Izzy is in a lot of trouble. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. That was a long one, but it's a detailed fight. And now it's time for us to talk about the co-main event, which is another absolute banger of a matchup. Let's take a deep dive into Derek Lewis and Tuivasa. Bam Bam against the Black Beast. There's going to be some violence in this one. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that the current average odds available on Derek Lewis, who is the favourite, is about 1.53, which is minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. If we take a look at the odds on Tuivasa, he is currently around an average of 2.60, which is plus 160 for an implied probability of 38%. So in the eyes of the bookies, we have got Derek Lewis as a pretty big favourite in this matchup. And in terms of the tail of the tape, Derek Lewis is 37 years old, 6'3" with a 79-inch reach. And Tuivasa is 28 years old, 6'2" with a 75-inch reach. So a couple of X factors for us to dig into there. The first being the age. We can see that Tuivasa is 9 years younger than Derek Lewis. And the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. 7-0. So with Derek Lewis being a big favourite, that statistic would suggest those odds are a little bit off. And if you're purely betting on that statistic alone, there would be a lot of value on Tuivasa. Like I say, 70% of the time the younger fighter wins when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. Having said that, even though 37 years old is very old for a fighter, heavyweights tend to peak later on in their career. So 37 years old isn't crazy old for a heavyweight, but you wouldn't expect Black Beast to be getting any better at this stage in his career. You would definitely expect him to be plateauing as he reaches the tail end of his career. On that note, Tuivasa at the age of 28, you would expect to be making big improvements from fight to fight. And we know that he's gone to places like American Kickboxing Academy to make improvements, and he's gym hopped a little bit. But I'm a little bit disappointed in Tuivasa because since he came into the UFC all the way back in 2017, which, he's been in the UFC for just over 4 years now, he hasn't really improved that much. And the same weaknesses that we saw from him all the way back in 2017, when he was only 23, 24 years old, they still exist now, which is really, really disappointing because Tuivasa is so young, you'd expect him to be making exponential improvements from fight to fight. And from my perspective, he hasn't. He still has huge weaknesses in every single aspect of MMA, which we'll be going into a lot of detail when we talk about how these guys match up from a striking and a grappling point of view. But yeah, Tuivasa just isn't really improving, and so that is a big shame for me. So the other X factor is obviously the reach. Derek Lewis has got a 4-inch reach advantage, and I guess that's going to segue nicely into us talking about how these guys match up from a striking point of view. Because 4 inches is a nice reach to have in a fight like this. We know that Derek Lewis is very fast at covering distance for a big guy, and he really reaches and overextends on his power punches. So certainly doesn't hurt that his arms are 4 inches longer than Ty's. It'll obviously make it easier for Lewis to land those big power shots on a range from which Tuivasa couldn't counter. So doesn't hurt to have a 4-inch reach advantage in this matchup. And in terms of striking, I know I'm probably going to take a lot of criticism for what I'm about to say, but I really need you to know, if you're watching this video, every week I have people leave comments saying you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that. Okay, what I would say is, if you doubt anything I say in these breakdown videos, go watch footage and see it for yourself. So I'm about to say something detrimental towards Tuivasa that people aren't going to like because he's a very popular fighter. But if you want to see it for yourself, I highly recommend going and checking out his last fight against Augusto Sakai, and in particular his fight against Blagoy Ivanov. Because Tai Tuivasa has built up this reputation for being, a dangerous boxer, a good striker in the UFC's heavyweight division. And his boxing is actually very, very, very bad. He is an extremely low-level striker who is painfully inaccurate and very bad defensively. And like I say, if you want to see this for yourself, please go watch his last fight against Sakai, and more importantly, the Blagoy Ivanov fight. Tuivasa has an issue with his striking that you see in a lot of fighters that aren't confident in their hands, in that Tuivasa is completely ineffective fighting at distance. So when he stood in front of his opponent in kickboxing range, he's a sitting duck. He's very easy to hit. And with his boxing, with his hands, he really doesn't land very much. His volume is low and he's painfully inaccurate. And because Tuivasa knows this, what you see from him is when he comes forward and attacks his opponent, he will kind of just come forward and blitz them. So he'll rush forward and he'll load up on big, huge power shots. But when he does that, he has a habit of running into guys. And when he runs into them, They then initiate the clinch, and so a lot of Tuivasa's fights actually end up taking place in the clinch because he comes forward awkwardly and he kind of runs into them. That's just what. Sorry, just closing some stuff down. That's kind of what you see from Tuivasa's style of striking, style of boxing. Sorry, we'll talk about his kicks in a moment. So, on the feet, this is a very, very dangerous matchup for Tai Tuivasa because he's very bad defensively, does tend to get hit a lot, and while he has a very good chin and he's very good at recovering when he gets hurt and he's very, very tough, obviously you don't want to be taking clean, hard shots from a guy like Derek Lewis, because if you make one mistake, he lands clean and hard on you. We saw what he did to Dorcas very recently. He can shut your lights out with one shot. So in terms of boxing, Tuivasa is in a lot of trouble here, and Derek Lewis stands a really good chance of knocking this guy out. But what's very interesting about this matchup, and why it is difficult from a betting point of view, is that both these guys have extreme advantages in areas that the other is weak. So an example of that is Lewis is an extremely dangerous boxer. He's got one-shot KO power in every strike, and we know Tuivasa is very bad defensively. But we know that Derek Lewis is also a guy that stands flat-footed, heavy on his lead leg, and isn't the most mobile, right? He doesn't have very good movement. Derek Lewis relies on you feeling his power and him putting you in a defensive shell, because you really don't want to feel that power. You really don't want him to land a big shot. He relies on you respecting his power so much that you don't come forward and attack him, and that kind of, helps him get away with his lack of mobility and footwork. But then every once in a while, he'll run into an opponent like Cyril Gane or Mark Hunt that's not intimidated by his power, because they can either read him and get out the way, or they're just confident in their own ability to be able to take his power. And they'll come forward, they'll pressure Lewis, force him to fight in an uncomfortable range, and that's when he's in a lot of trouble. What's interesting about Tuivasa is that he does two things really well, which can exploit this huge weakness in Lewis. The first is, he's a wild guy. He is a wild guy that we absolutely love. He's a great character, and he's the kind of guy that will not respect Lewis, and I think that's a good thing. We know Tuivasa is going to come forward, and while he is bad defensively, he's going to come forward, load up on big shots, and he could land something on Lewis. Lewis isn't particularly good defensively either. It's just that Lewis isn't as reckless as Tuivasa to go with it. But the other huge advantage that Tuivasa has in this fight are his leg kicks. And now a lot of people talk about leg kicks, and leg kicks are obviously a big part of MMA now, and they're important to talk about in every fight. But every once in a while you come across a guy whose leg kicks are an extremely dangerous weapon that can completely dictate how a fight plays out. And Tuivasa is definitely a guy that has that kind of leg kick. Tuivasa, a lot of people look at him like he's some, really skilled boxer, but in actual fact, his leg kicks are by far his best weapon. Tai Tuivasa's leg kicks are brilliant. They're so fast, they're so accurate, and they're very difficult to read. The speed at which he can throw them out there, and there's no telegraph, you just don't see them coming. They're very, very difficult to deal with. And this is significant because we've seen Mark Hunt, we've seen Cyril Gane injure Derek Lewis's legs in his past fights. We know Derek Lewis has had a lot of recurring injuries with his legs. He's blown his knee out a few times. He's actually suffered leg injuries in fights. And Tai Tuivasa has the best leg kicks in the heavyweight division. Probably the nastiest leg kicks in the UFC with how big he is and how hard he lands them. So while Tai Tuivasa is going to be a sitting duck to the knockout because of how dangerous Lewis is and how bad Tuivasa is defensively, Lewis isn't mobile enough to get out the way of Tai's leg kicks. And so both these guys have huge fight-changing, fight-ending weapons that they can use to cause the other a problem. And for that reason, this one is going to get real spicy when they both clash in the octagon on Saturday night. But there has been one weakness that has plagued Tai Tuivasa throughout his UFC career, and that's of course his takedown defense and grappling. This guy really has no takedown defense and no ground game at all. He's an absolute white belt on the ground, doesn't know how to defend himself, and just doesn't know how to defend a takedown. And while he did do a little bit of training at AKA to work with the likes of Daniel Cormier and Khabib Nurmagomedov and Cain Velasquez to address this hole in his skill set, I haven't really seen any evidence of that improvement. And now I know we haven't really seen his takedown offense and ground game tested that much since he started training at AKA. I think he moved to AKA after losing to Sergey Spivak all the way back in 2019. So it's possible that he could have made huge improvements to his grappling in that time. But we've already spoken in this breakdown video about some pretty significant weaknesses to Tai Tuivasa's striking skill set. And he hasn't improved them at all in the 4 years that he's been in the UFC. So I'm very reluctant to assume he's going to have improved his grappling in the last 2 years. Because surely if striking's his bread and butter, we would see big improvements to his striking, and we haven't. We really haven't. His level of improvement has been very, very disappointing. Now you're probably thinking, this doesn't matter, right? Why would we be talking about grappling, in a matchup between two strikers, right? The majority of Derek Lewis's fights are stand-up fights, so why do we have to worry about Tai Tuivasa's takedown offense and ground game? And I've heard Dan Hardy say in his breakdown video for this fight that the chances of Derek Lewis taking Tai Tuivasa down in this are very slim. And that's where I disagree with Dan Hardy, because if you go back and you watch Derek Lewis's early fights in the UFC, a lot of his fights did take place on the ground. And while Derek Lewis isn't a great grappler, if he takes Tuivasa down, and it won't be difficult to do that, if he takes Tuivasa down, we've seen how heavy Derek Lewis is from top position, and we've seen how weak Tai Tuivasa is off his back. Earlier in Derek Lewis's career, he used to rack up a lot of wins by taking guys down, getting into top position, and be so heavy on top that they couldn't work their way back up to their feet. And then because he had so much power in his hands, he would get stoppages with ground and pound from top position, which interestingly is how Junior Dos Santos beat Tai Tuivasa, right? Says the stoppage was due to punches. It was because Tai Tuivasa was stuck on his back, mounted, didn't know how to defend himself, and JDS stopped him with ground and pound from top position. And I could definitely see the same thing happening here. If Tai Tuivasa's got really bad takedown offense, which we know he has, and he comes out the gate and starts hammering Derek Lewis's legs, do you not think Derek Lewis might be tempted to either try and catch one of those kicks and turn it into a takedown, or alleviate the trouble he's in standing and not take those leg kicks anymore by trying to get this guy to the ground? And if this fight does go to the ground, Lewis is going to absolutely dominate him. Like I say, Lewis isn't a particularly good grappler, but you don't need to be with how bad Tai Tuivasa is on the ground. So that's another factor for us to take into consideration. So when I look at this fight, the odds do absolutely make sense to me. This fight's taking place in Houston, which is, Derek Lewis's hometown. And I know that the title fight against Cyril Gane also took place in Derek Lewis's hometown. But, Derek Lewis says he underperformed against Gane because of the pressure of the crowd, the pressure of fighting in front of his hometown. But I don't fully buy that. I just think Cyril Gane was a very difficult stylistic match for Derek Lewis. Ultimately, we know Lewis could get a lift from the crowd. If it did end up going to a decision and ended up being a close fight, he could get a nod from the hometown judges. And on top of that, we know he's got a huge advantage on the ground, right? If this fight goes to the ground, Lewis is going to be the only guy winning. On top of that, again, we know Tuivasa's got very bad striking defense, and Derek Lewis is extremely dangerous standing. So the only real advantages that Tuivasa has over Lewis in this fight are his leg kicks. Everything else kind of goes to Lewis. So that's the reason why Lewis is the favourite. That's the reason why I think the odds are roughly where they should be on this one. And that's why I'm not interested in betting on Tai Tuivasa as an underdog. Sure, he might be able to catch Lewis with a bomb or hurt him real bad and win the fight as a result of his leg kicks. But Derek Lewis has far more advantages in this one. For me, I don't think it's smart to back Derek Lewis as a big favourite, because obviously Tai Tuivasa is dangerous, and we know Derek Lewis is very susceptible to those leg kicks. So this is one of those fights that I look at the odds and I see them as roughly where they should be. I don't see a strong position on either side. I don't see value on either side. And I think this one is a very, very easy pass. So I hope you found that useful. let's move on to the next one. My God, this is a long video. Complicated fights that I love it. UFC 271, the matchmakers, the UFC matchmakers doing the Lord's work at the moment, giving us some great fights to dig into. I am absolutely blessed. I fucking love my job. There's no better job in the world. And let's get into the next one. It's going to be Derek Lewis against Jared Cannonier. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that the average odds available on Jared Cannonier are about 1.59, which is minus 169 for an implied probability of 63%. And if we take a look at the odds on Derek Brunson, he's currently around an average of 2.40, which is plus 140 for an implied probability of 42%. So by the odds, this is roughly 60-40 in favour of Jared Cannonier. So let's take a deep dive into this matchup and see if either of these dudes is worth betting this weekend. So whenever we talk about Derek Lewis and Jared Cannonier, we've always got to reference their age. So it'll be quite nice in this matchup to not have that as a factor, because they're both very old for the middleweight division. Derek Lewis is 38 years old, Jared Cannonier is 37 years old. So they're both very old, which doesn't mean anything in the context of this matchup, other than you would expect both of these guys to be declining from fight to fight at this late stage in their careers. Having said that, there is no coincidence that the UFC have put this fight on the main card of Israel Adesanya against Robert Whittaker, because if we think about it, there's no obvious number one contender now in the middleweight division. So by putting Cannonier and Brunson on this card, they're going to be on the same timeline as Izzy and Whittaker, where, if there are no major injuries in 3-4 months time, these guys are going to be on the same schedule to fight again. And so I think it's pretty obvious that this is a number one contender fight. There's a huge prize up for grabs, and you'd expect the winner of this fight to fight the winner of Whittaker and Izzy for the title. So I'm sure both these guys understand that. I'm sure they're both aware of that. They've been talking about wanting the title shot for a very, very long time. And so, one of the reasons why older fighters tend to decline, later on in their career, one of the reasons why Father Time's undefeated is that as you get older, motivation starts to wane a little bit, right? You realize you're never going to be a champion. You're not going to be able to compete with these young, hungry bulls. And, maybe the dream's over. With Cannonier and Brunson, they've got a big prize, and a lot of motivation coming into this matchup, because they know there's a title shot waiting for them. And so as a result of that, I wouldn't expect them to look that different, from their most recent fights. Brunson obviously against Till, Cannonier obviously against Gastelum. In terms of the how these guys match up from a size point of view, Derek Brunson's 6'1" with a 77-inch reach, and Gerard Cannonier is 5'11" with a 77-inch reach. So both guys roughly about the same size, roughly about the same age. Like Goldie would say, virtually identical. So now let's talk about how these guys match up from a stylistic point of view. And to anyone that knows anything about these two guys, it's very clear that this is a striker versus grappler matchup. Derek Brunson, former NCAA Division III level wrestler, and Jared Cannonier, dangerous, powerful striker who's built a career off knocking people out. And this is a very interesting matchup because both guys, again, like with Lewis and Tuivasa, they both have extreme advantages in the area that the other is weak. We think about Derek Brunson's weaknesses. A little bit chinny, a little bit reckless, a little bit bad defensively, and a little bit susceptible to the knockout. You look at Cannonier, fast, accurate, powerful strikes, and the technique, the skill, the power to knock you out dead with every single shot that he lands. Big power in his hands, big power in his kicks. And so he will pose a significant threat to Derek Brunson while this fight is on the feet. He'll hold a big advantage over Derek Brunson when it comes to striking, and he'll also stand a very good chance of making Brunson pay for his weaknesses in terms of being bad defensively by knocking him out. But like I said, Derek Brunson, former NCAA Division III level wrestler, and we know that Jared Cannonier, his weakness is on the ground. His takedown offense isn't bulletproof. We know that this guy can be taken down. So we know that if the fight stays standing, Jared Cannonier is going to have a pretty big advantage over Derek Brunson. He's got big power in his hands. He throws a nice diverse range of attacks. And whenever we've seen Brunson on the feet, he does look very uncomfortable. He does hit hard. I'm not saying Brunson can't catch Cannonier with something big and knock him out. But on the feet, Cannonier is a much higher level striker than Brunson. So if the majority of this fight stays standing, Cannonier is going to get the win. This fight comes down to, can Derek Brunson get the fight to the ground and keep the fight on the ground for Cannonier, or for long enough to either, stop Cannonier on the ground or win a decision. And what I can tell you about Cannonier's takedown defense is that it's actually very, very good. And it gets better as fights wear on. Because Cannonier is a natural striker, he's very good at reading his opponents. As the fight wears on, he gets better and better and better at reading takedown entries. So it's a lot easier to take this guy down earlier in a fight than it is later in a fight. Because later on in a fight, he can spot the subtle changes in body language and he can read those takedown entries coming. So Gerard Cannonier, very, very good takedown offense. Does a good job of seeing the takedown entries come early. He's got strong hips, a good ability to clear his legs when you try and shoot in on him, and he does dig underhooks very, very quickly as well. But his takedown offense isn't bulletproof. You can get this guy to the ground, but that's not a deal breaker for me. Like I always say, I don't mind if a guy doesn't have bulletproof takedown defense, as long as they're pretty good at working their way back up to their feet. And Cannonier is. He doesn't hesitate in bad positions on the ground. As soon as he hits the ground, he's immediately looking to scramble back up to his feet. And because he's such a big, strong, physically imposing dude, he's very, very difficult to hold down. Now, Derek Brunson is a good offensive wrestler, but there is a weakness that has plagued Derek Brunson throughout his career with his MMA grappling, which I think is the reason why, for a large chunk of his career, he didn't use his wrestling that much. And the weakness Derek Brunson's got is that he's very, very good at getting opponents to the ground, but his top game isn't that heavy. What you see Derek Brunson do a lot of the time is, do a really good job of getting guys down, but then he gets a little bit impatient on the ground and he rushes to either inflict a lot of damage on the ground or advance position. And when you posture up to land ground and pound, on your opponent on the ground, or you are trying to advance position, you're obviously giving your opponent, who you're on top of, space to improve their position and create scrambles and ultimately get back up to their feet. This is a significant factor in this matchup because Cannonier has shown that if you take him down, if you give him just a little bit of space, he'll use that space to just power back up to his feet. And so this is a difficult stylistic matchup for Derek Brunson because we know Brunson's offensive wrestling becomes less effective as the fight wears on. And we know Gerard Cannonier's takedown defense gets better as fights wear on. So this fight is going to get more difficult for Brunson the longer it goes. So if Brunson doesn't get a finish early, you'd expect Cannonier to finish strong. This is also a difficult fight for Brunson because even though he's very good at getting his opponents down, his top control, his grappling control isn't great. He struggles to hold guys down for long periods. He had a little bit of success with this in the Darren Till fight, but the outcome of that matchup was more to do with mistakes that Darren Till made as opposed to how good Brunson looked on the ground. Brunson made the same mistakes he always makes in that fight in terms of giving Till a lot of space to move around on the bottom and work his way back up to his feet if he wanted to. Except Till chose to stay on the ground and hesitate and not really show much of an effort to get back up to his feet. Exactly like what we spoke about earlier in the video, the mistakes that Izzy made in the Jan Blachowicz fight. We saw Till do exactly the same stuff against Brunson. We've never seen Cannonier do that. Whenever he's taken down, he always shows a lot of urgency to quickly pop back up to his feet. And so this is going to be difficult for Brunson to get Cannonier down and keep him down for long enough to win this fight. So this is a very difficult stylistic matchup for Derek Brunson because Cannonier's got a big advantage over him on the feet. Cannonier's tough, he's got a good chin, he's got a good gas tank. And even though Brunson's a much better grappler than Cannonier, and he will definitely have an advantage over Cannonier on the ground, Cannonier is difficult to take down, difficult to hold down, and Brunson doesn't have a very heavy top game. So for those reasons, I think Cannonier is very likely to win this weekend, and maybe someone you might want to consider betting. Strongly recommend you do your own research, listen to what I've said in this breakdown video, and then go back, and watch the last 2-3 fights of both guys to fact check this and, learn it for yourself. Don't shoot me, bro, if Cannonier loses, but I do think he wins quite a decent percentage of the time here. And it's a tough fight for Brunson. Not a fight that Brunson can't win, but a fight that he's going to, potentially going to struggle in quite a bit, I would imagine. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's take a look at the next fight between Kyler Phillips. Maybe I need to get some of these glasses for these breakdown videos. Do you think I could rock these glasses? Nah, Kyler Phillips, way too cool for me, man. I need the hair to go with it. Way too cool, way too cool. Alright, let's get into it. Let's start off by taking a look at the odds. So Kyler Phillips, one of the biggest favourites on the card, at average odds of about 1.24. Which is minus 417 for an implied probability of 81%. And if we take a look at the odds on Marcelo Rojo, he's currently around an average of 4.30, which is plus 330 for an implied probability of 23%. So Phillips, a massive favourite in this one. Phillips is 26 years old, 5'8", with a 72-inch reach. And Marcelo Rojo is 33 years old, 5'8", with a 71-inch reach. So in terms of their size, virtually identical. But Kyler Phillips is 7 years younger than Marcelo Rojo, and the younger fighter wins around 65% of the time when there is a 7-year age gap in a fight. So earlier on, the odds based on the ages were a little bit skewed on the Lewis versus Tuivasa fight, but we would expect Phillips to be, a pretty big favourite in this one, with him being that much younger than Marcelo Rojo. So, how do these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view? It's an interesting fight, this. I know there is a lot of hype on Kyler Phillips at the moment, but I do feel Kyler Phillips is one of these guys that is a little bit overhyped, and he does have a lot of issues with his skill set, which I do feel will result in him struggling against a lot of guys as he starts to move up through the ranks and continue to face a decent level of opponent. Although, to be fair, Song Yadong and Rowley and Piver in your first two fights in the UFC, that's certainly no picnic. Those dudes are pretty legit. But let's talk about how these guys match up. So, Kyler Phillips has a huge issue with his overall fighting style, which will get him into a lot of trouble against almost everyone he faces, because with Kyler Phillips, he wastes a lot of energy. There's a lot of wasted movement with Phillips. If you go and watch Phillips in the first round of any of his fights, you'll see him, bouncing around, light on his feet, loads of footwork, loads of movement. He calls himself the Matrix, which gives a little clue in, as to what his fighting style is. This guy is just all over the place, almost like a capoeira style at times, almost like he's dancing. He's all over the place. He's bouncing all around the octagon. But all that movement, all that footwork, all that explosive energy takes energy. And unfortunately, there are very few guys who can move around as much as Kyler Phillips can move around without slowing down significantly. There are very few of them. A Dominic Cruz springs to mind. Maybe a TJ Dillashaw, although he certainly doesn't move around as much as Phillips. But there are certain guys that can use a lot of footwork and a lot of movement, but Phillips is not one of those guys. And what you see from Phillips is he's very light on his feet. He moves very well in round one, but with every round that ticks by, he becomes much more flat-footed. And this is a huge issue because everything that Kyler Phillips does well stems from his footwork and movement. He sets his strikes up from his footwork and movement. He sets his grappling up through his footwork and movement. And so when the footwork and movement slows, everything else slows as well. And his striking doesn't become as effective. He becomes a lot easier to hit. He's much worse defensively. And his offensive wrestling is nowhere near as effective either. But what's interesting about this matchup is that Marcelo Rojo is also a guy with a tendency to slow down a bit as fights wear on. So both these guys start strong, finish badly. And so because of that, it may not be that much of an issue in this fight, because it's not like either of these guys is facing an opponent that is going to be able to weather the early storm and finish stronger. They're probably both going to slow down at a pretty equal rate here. But they both do have very different styles. Phillips likes to mix things up a lot, bounces around on the outside, blitzes forward with, crazy spinning attacks, throws massive explosive kicks, and, mixes in his striking and grappling really well. He's got great reactive double leg takedowns. Marcelo Rojo, on the other hand, is a guy that likes to take control of the center of the octagon, come forward, and has a very heavy boxing style. And he's looking to pressure you into an uncomfortable range and hurt you really bad with his boxing. And I know that Kyler Phillips is very hyped up. I know that he's a big favorite. I know a lot of people are very high on him. But I actually think Rojo's got the advantage here when it comes to striking. I just think Phillips is great in round one, but I don't see him being anywhere near as good of a boxer as Rojo is. I think Phillips' striking is predominantly kicks based, and it's a lot easier to punch someone in the face than it is to kick him in the head. I also think that with Rojo's constant forward pressure, he's going to wear Phillips down, and when Phillips does start to become tired, he's going to become very easy to hit, and that's where Rojo can really start to have a lot of success with his boxing. There is, however, one weakness that Rojo's got in his skill set, which Kyler Phillips is well positioned to exploit, and that is Rojo is one of these guys that, even though he's not that easy to take down, if you do take Rojo down, he hesitates a lot on the ground and takes a really long time to work his way back up to his feet. So even when Phillips gets tired, his offensive wrestling is pretty good. He's a little bit like Derek Brunson in many ways, in that he's very good at getting his opponents to the ground, but then he doesn't have the most physically imposing style of grappling. He doesn't have the heaviest top game, and he often gets a little bit impatient on the ground, even when tired, in terms of being overly aggressive with ground and pound or trying to advance his position, which then gives his opponent time and space to create scrambles and work their way back up to their feet. That's usually something that will get Kyler Phillips into trouble. And it might get him into trouble in this matchup. But it might not. And it probably won't. Because Marcelo Rojo is one of these guys that hesitates a lot on the ground and allows you to kind of hold him down and rack up control time. This is pretty significant because not only does that mean even when Phillips is being aggressive on the ground, he may still be able to rack up a lot of control time because Rojo's not going to make that much of an effort to get back up to his feet. But it's also quite significant because what you notice about Phillips is when he starts to get tired, he starts to grapple a lot more. So early in a fight, when he's still fresh, he won't really grapple at all. He'll just use a lot of his striking. But then as soon as he starts to get tired and he realizes his striking's not as effective, that's when he goes to his grappling. And that's huge because if Phillips starts to get tired and then starts to use a lot of grappling, when he's going to be taking Rojo down, if Rojo's not making much of an effort to pop back up to his feet, Phillips is going to be able to run the clock down, put points in the bag, steal rounds with takedowns, rack up a lot of control time, and pace himself a lot better when he's starting to get tired. So I understand why Phillips is a pretty big favourite here, because even though Rojo's probably a slightly better striker and has a slight advantage on the feet, I think Phillips can cause Rojo big trouble with his grappling. And so that's why he's a big favourite. This is not personally a fight that I want to bet. I don't want to bet Rojo because of how much he hesitates on the ground. He really doesn't make much of an effort to work his way back up to his feet at all. But at the same time, there's far too many issues with Phillips to even consider betting him as a big favourite. He's not great defensively. His boxing's not good. He slows down a lot as fights wear on. And his grappling IQ's not good either because he wastes a lot of energy and is impatient on the ground, which gives his opponents an opportunity to scramble back up to their feet. So this one's a pass from me, but it will be very interesting to see how Phillips deals with the aggression of Rojo and his boxing-heavy style of fighting, because Rojo is no joko, and the odds are perhaps a little bit disrespectful on this one. So we now get into the final fight that we're going to talk about in today's video. And remember, if you want to watch more of these breakdown videos, head over to my website, MMABettingTips.com. I've got breakdown videos on there for every single fight on this card. There's a link for it in the description below. You're going to love the community. Check it out. But for this fight between Bobby Green and Nasrat Haqparast, we need to start off by taking a look at the odds. So we can see that Bobby Green is the favourite at average odds of about 1.72, which is minus 139 for an implied probability of 58%. And if we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Nasrat Haqparast, he's currently around an average of 2.20, which is plus 120 for an implied probability of 45%. So both guys in the even money odds range, with Green as the slight favourite. So Bobby Green is 35 years old and Nasrat Haqparast is 26 years old, which means Haqparast is 9 years younger than Bobby Green in this fight. And like we already said with the Tuivasa versus Derek Lewis matchup, that means, you know, the fighter with the fighter that's 9 years younger wins around 70% of the time, you know, when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. So again, that statistic leans more towards Nasrat taking this. In terms of the size, Bobby Green 5'10" with a 71-inch reach, and Haqparast 5'10" with a 72-inch reach. So both guys roughly about the same size, but that age could play a bit of a factor in this matchup. Bobby Green at 35 years old is unlikely to be getting better. You know, he's going to be plateauing. 35 years old is quite old for a lightweight, and so Father Time's undefeated. You would expect Bobby Green to be declining from fight to fight. Whereas with Haqparast at 26 years old, you'd expect him to be making big improvements from fight to fight. He trains with some of the best fighters in the world. He does gym hop a lot, but obviously he's often cornered by Firas Zahabi and George St. Pierre. He's got a good relationship with GSP. He's trained with Khabib, the Izatar brothers, and Haqparast has got a lot of friends in high places and trains in a lot of very good gyms with a lot of very high-level talented fighters. What I will say about Haqparast, though, is exactly the same as what I said about Tai Tuivasa, in that I do feel Haqparast's level of improvement isn't good. He did come into the UFC when he was very young. He's only 26 now. He made his debut all the way back in 2017, just like with Tuivasa. So he came into the UFC when he was like 22, 23 years old, and he hasn't really improved that much over the last 3-4 years. He's very similar to the guy that made his debut all the way back in 2017, which is a huge red flag and a bit disappointing. I would have expected to see much more improvement from Haqparast with how good he is and with the guys that he trains with and the coaches that he works with. But it is what it is. Still at 26 years old, he's extremely young and plenty of time to improve in the future. I'm sure Haqparast will develop to be an even better fighter than he already is. And of course, he is already extremely good. Haqparast, for his age, is great everywhere with no real major weaknesses, which makes this a very, very interesting fight. So both these guys are primarily strikers, and how these guys match up when it comes to striking is a little bit complex. So let's cover off grappling first, because that'll be far quicker to talk about. So Bobby Green actually is a wrestler, right? We know that the majority of his fights stay standing. We know that he likes to strike now, and Bobby Green has this reputation for being a striker. But Bobby Green started life as a wrestler and has now evolved into a striker. He uses his wrestling in reverse to keep fights where he wants them, to keep them, fights on his terms, which is standing up. But because Bobby Green started life as a wrestler, his takedown offense is brilliant. He's very, very difficult to hold down. You take Bobby Green down and he can usually pop back up to his feet like a spring. I don't think it's going to matter anyway, because Nasrat Haqparast never tries to take his opponents down. But even if he wanted to, there's no way Nasrat's going to be able to take Bobby Green down and hold him down. Not a chance. We have seen a few guys take Nasrat Haqparast down and have some success with him, on the ground. We saw this in his last fight against Dan Hooker. But Nasrat is one of these guys that does actually have pretty good takedown defense. And he is pretty hard to hold down as well. Nasrat does a really good job of scrambling back up to his feet when he does get taken down. You're probably thinking, what's this guy talking about, right? Hooker took him down and held him down quite easily. But the difference in the Hooker fight is that he applied relentless pressure to Haqparast spammed a lot of takedowns and wore Haqparast down to the point where Haqparast was too tired to defend the takedowns and then too tired to work his way back up to his feet when Hooker eventually did get him down. So Hooker followed the exact same game plan and strategy we mentioned at the very beginning of this video that Whittaker needs to use in order to cause Israel Adesanya a problem. It worked to great effect against Haqparast, and Haqparast doesn't have a bad gas tank. Haqparast has a great gas tank, but Hooker showed in that fight how effective this strategy can be. It's quite interesting as Izzy's training partner. But Bobby Green doesn't usually try to take his opponents down. And even though we have seen him occasionally use his grappling offensively, he tried to take Clay Guida down briefly. Bobby Green isn't a persistent grappler. He's not the kind of wrestler that is going to, attack with a lot of chain wrestling. And so because Nasrat has really good takedown offense on single shot takedown entries, and he's very good at working his way back up to his feet, I don't see grappling being a factor in this one, because Bobby Green's not going to be persistent enough to get this fight to the ground and keep this fight on the ground. So that is a non-event for me. I think this is going to be a stand-up fight. Now, in terms of how these two guys match up from a striking point of view, they're both primarily boxers with very, very different styles of boxing. Bobby Green likes to fight with his hands down low, chin up high, and he likes to rely on his ability to read his opponent, to use a lot of head movement, to slip shots, roll with the punches, and that kind of thing. Nasrat, much more traditional boxing style, fights out the southpaw stance, likes to stay behind that high boxing guard, catch a lot of his opponent's shots on the hands, the gloves, the arms, and look to counter from behind that high boxing guard. Two completely different styles. Both very good defensively in their own way. Haqparast good behind the high boxing guard, and Bobby Green very, very good at seeing the shots come in, using head movement to roll and slip and shoulder roll and all that kind of stuff. Bobby Green, very, very, very good. Offensively, both guys kind of like to just chip away at their opponents. They're not really power strikers. Bobby Green likes to work from behind the jab and kind of has like a blitzing style. Nasrat, again, likes to stay behind the high boxing guard and much prefers the counter. I guess Bobby Green's more of a guy that likes to lead. Nasrat is more of a guy that likes to counter. But I think the big difference between these two is speed. And in terms of speed, you would expect the younger fighter, the young hungry bull, to be a lot faster than the old lion. But that's not the case here. Bobby Green's actually very fast, very accurate. And because he's so hard to hit, because he's so elusive, when Bobby Green's at his best, he's extremely difficult to land on and extremely difficult to deal with when he comes forward, because he's very difficult to read. You don't know what he's going to do. Very unpredictable guy. The problem with Bobby Green is that he's very inconsistent, and he's been plagued by inconsistency his entire career. Bobby Green is an elite fighter, as good as it gets when it comes to MMA grappling, as good as it gets when it comes to striking. He's also got an amazing chin, an amazing gas tank, and he's tough as nails. He's got all the attributes that anyone would ever need to become a UFC champion. But he's never worked his way into that title picture because he's inconsistent. And just so often in Bobby Green's career, he makes bad decisions in fights that ultimately result in costing him. Some of the mistakes that he makes is you'll see him have long periods of inactivity where he really doesn't do a lot in rounds. He'll showboat a lot and play around and fool around, but while doing this, he won't really be scoring. He's not throwing and landing. And he also has this really annoying tendency of, when he doesn't respect his opponents, he actually likes to just walk forward and allow them to punch him in the face. And he'll kind of roll with the shots and brush it off and gesture to the crowd and the judges that it didn't land and it didn't hurt him. But ultimately, the shots do land, and he is allowing his opponents to land shots and score points. And he doesn't land anything back in return, which means he loses a lot of rounds just through screwing around. And what's actually weird about Bobby Green as well is that at times he looks very sloppy and very easy to hit. There are times when he's like a ghost in the octagon, and he's so fast, so elusive, it's very difficult to land on him. I think we can all agree, as an example, that Rafael Fiziev is one of the best strikers in the lightweight division. A far better striker than Thiago Moises. You look at Thiago Moises, doesn't really have any boxing. He's got a predominantly kicks-based style of striking. Thiago Moises has got a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, whereas Rafael Fiziev, like I say, one of the best strikers in the lightweight division. And yet Thiago Moises was able to light Bobby Green up and inflict tons of damage, whereas Fiziev wasn't able to get near Bobby Green. Bobby Green was so elusive, so good defensively in that fight. And so GSP famously said the fighting is 90% mental. And there are no better examples of this than with Bobby Green, because he's got everything he needs to be a world champion except for fight IQ, except for this. And he's very inconsistent, and you never know what version of him you're going to get. When Bobby Green is at his best, he's a nightmare to deal with. But when he's at his worst, he's a bit of a pussycat. And so breaking this fight down is difficult because we don't know what version of Bobby Green we're going to get. You can't really apply sense or logic to Bobby Green's career. It's so random what version of him shows up. Go and watch Bobby Green's first fight against Lando Venata and his second fight against Lando Venata as a really good example of how this guy is Jekyll and Hyde. He fought the same guy twice and looked completely different in both matchups. So his fights against Lando Venata will show you exactly what I'm talking about. So for all of Nasrat Haqparast's weaknesses, and there aren't many, one strength that Haqparast has and what I really like about him is that he's very consistent. This guy always shows up and performs to the best of his ability, and you know exactly what you're getting from him. That's something that we can't say about Bobby Green. But one area Bobby Green may have that he could cause Nasrat a problem is his gamesmanship in the octagon. The showboating, the trash talk, the games that he plays. Because Haqparast has shown at times that he is a little bit hot-headed. When he got knocked out against Drew Dober and then came back in his return fight against Munoz, it was clear that he wanted to make a statement in that Munoz fight and knock Munoz out. So he came forward very aggressively, fought a lot more recklessly than he usually does, and ultimately resulted in taking a lot of damage that he didn't need to take. Munoz had a lot more success in that fight than you would have expected him to have, because Nasrat was aggressive and wanted to make a statement and put himself in a lot of danger. That's risky to me, with a guy like Bobby Green, because if Bobby Green starts talking trash and showboating in the fight, he might wind Nasrat up, he might frustrate him, he might throw him off his game, and then Haqparast might start to headhunt and get into a brawl, which is probably exactly what Bobby wants. Now on the flip side, Nasrat comes from a very good team, surrounded by very good people, and he's a young, hungry, intelligent fighter that is going to know exactly what to expect. So it's not like he's going to find himself in there with Bobby Green and be completely thrown off by the showmanship, the showboating, the gamesmanship. He knows Bobby Green is going to talk trash and play these games with him. And so if he's ready for this and he can stick to a game plan and stay disciplined, it shouldn't matter too much. But it's definitely something for us to consider. So in terms of how I would approach this fight from a betting point of view, there's no way that I would bet Bobby Green in this fight. I would really go as far as saying Bobby Green is a bad bet. And the reason why I come to that conclusion is because if we look at the odds on Bobby Green, he's currently around about a 1.71 favourite, which is an implied probability of 58%. With how inconsistent Bobby Green is, it's always 50-50 whether he's going to show up or not. 50% of the time we're going to get the version of Bobby Green that fought Thiago Moises and the version that Nasrat Haqparast would absolutely smoke. And then 50% of the time we're going to get the world-class, championship level Bobby Green that fought Rafael Fiziev that Haqparast is probably going to struggle against. But in order to bet Bobby Green, you've got to give him a better than 58% chance of winning to find any value. And because he's so inconsistent, whether it's because it's 50-50 whether this guy's going to show up or not, it's impossible for you to cap him at better than 58%. So Bobby Green's a very easy pass. This fight is dog or pass. If you want to bet this fight, you absolutely have to go with Haqparast, because even though his underdog odds give you a slightly better risk to reward ratio, it's also a huge deal that he's consistent. On Saturday night, whatever happens, Nasrat Haqparast is going to show up and perform, because he always does. The same can't be said about Bobby Green. So if you want to bet this fight, gotta take Nasrat. This is dog or pass all day long. It's a no-brainer. So I hope you found that breakdown video useful. The UFC 271 main card is a wrap. There's plenty more breakdown videos like this where I go into just as much depth as this on all the prelim fights. MMABettingTips.com. Go check it out. It's a banging website, banging community. Link in the description below. You already know what I'm going to ask for. It doesn't cost anything. Please hook me up and help me out. hit the like button below, subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment, get that YouTube algorithm firing for me, and I will see you same time, same place next week with another breakdown video for next week's card, which is a fucking banger. Rafael Fiziev, Rafael dos Anjos, UFC matchmakers doing the Lord's work. Have a great week. Hope you make loads of money on Saturday night. I'll see you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.